Thank you, Shaheen. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Lois. And thank you, Dean Hudson, for inviting me. This is a pleasure. Nice to see a full room at this hour. So let me start by explaining the title a bit. When I say fluid histories, I don't mean whatever goes. No, definitely does not. What it means is that we need to make an effort to rethink how we do architectural history. And the phrase is partly comes from the project that I am working on, which is on the Gangetic Plains. So I'm looking at fluvial landscapes. But it also has to do with not just, as I'll show, what happens when the land moves. Not just water moves, the land moves. So what assumptions in architecture and architectural history do we have to, if not abandon, really rethink in our understanding of the relation between built and natural worlds? But also thinking about what kind of sources do we privilege? Where do we stand? The old questions about doing architectural history. So I'm going to focus on three things, and this is my sort of introduction. One is about durational imagination, and this is coming as an architect and architectural historian. I always look back upon my training as an architect and how we were, taught to think about architectural representation, buildings, field work, and everything else, including when we do field work, how we do field work, and what are we supposed to sort of think about, sort of very fundamentals about time and space when we think about architecture. So I want to talk about three things in the beginning. So durational imagination, which is sort of structured into architectural history and architecture. Scale, which is so fundamental to anything architecture. And the important point is about vantage. So I'm going to sort of work with you through these. So just so you know that, if at any point you have a particular question that you're dying to ask right then, please put up your hands and I can answer that, okay? So I call, architecture and architectural history has what I call the prejudice of permanence. And this is a long, sort of historical legacy. I mean, depending on where you want to peg it, we can certainly do it with the, the coming of the Westphalian states and the desire to have these architectural planning interventions which will send the message of permanence, durability. And this is where durability of materials became sort of smushed into thinking about permanence stroke impermanence. So when I hear the terms, impermanence, temporary, ephemeral, being used interchangeably, guys, I have a problem. Because they're not the same things, okay? They are actually distinctly different. Permanence, impermanence, irrespective of durability, is about a political contract. Let's think about this. You can have a shanty town and you can have a brick masonry building, but you don't really have right to the land. You're illegal, okay? So that's not impermanent in durational terms. I mean, it's common sense. But it is impermanent from the state's point of view because you can be taken out any time unless you can, sort of leverage your political options. And I'm ultimately going to talk about ephemeral. For me, that is just the passing. In fact, some of the most lovely things about architecture is the passing, that ephemeral moment, that you recognize something, that passing thing that you cannot recapture in anything that we can close to think of being permanent. Permanence and the desire for permanence is about I think of it as not just hegemonic order, this is the order of the state. And again, I want to emphasize this. Let's say when states authorize big festivals, and they're temporary festivals. Think of, World's Fairs and all of that. The buildings are going to be gone in a bit, right? In a few months, say. But that doesn't mean that's really ephemeral. That claims a certain permanence. Think of what happened in the, 1893 Chicago. You have this temporary, white, city, and then it retains traces. Some buildings remain, others don't, but it does have a way of, sort of retaining the, the structural imprint. in one way or another. So the point is that arguments for permanence or impermanence is about exclusion and inclusion. And this is anybody who knows anything about colonial history would know that vast populations across the world were dispossessed simply because they did not have what passed as permanent brick, stone, masonry structures, because they didn't have claim to the land. So those kind of very problematic connections that have been made, and that's what I think of as modern history, recent history, that's what I study, are sort of fundamental to our understanding of what is architecture, what counts as architecture, what is worth understanding, what is worth studying. So the corollary of this is that there's a certain assumption of fixity that comes with this idea of permanence. And I always think about, how we were taught how to draw. This is, basics of architectural drawing. The assurance with which we drew the ground line, strong line, and we were told it has to be strong, making a clear distinction between what is underground, what is above ground, and that assurance, that certainty that this will remain underground and that will remain above ground, and they won't mix, is completely false. Anybody who's done any construction knows that. But it is also something that we continue to do, and it means a lot when we're thinking about actually landscapes that I'm going to talk about, fluvial landscapes, where that certainty is a figment of imagination. Now, all particles move at different paces, right? And so it depends on what scale you're looking at. You can apprehend different kinds of movements, different kinds of motion. But the assumption of fixity that comes in all architectural thinking, that we are looking at buildings which will not move, buildings which will stay put, is a durable sort of menace to our discipline. And the building as a solid, permanent structure, standing on permanent, fixed ground. So these are the two things I think are required real challenge, or us to challenge. And this has something to do with scale. And scale is also something that we are taught very early on as architecture students, because you have to have a sense of scale. So what we are typically taught is to have a sense of the proportion, reducing the real building to a smaller scaled artifact because you're drawing on a piece of paper. And a lot of shenanigans go in between those. We know that because you are not representing 1:1. So you feel not responsible for scales of intervention that are not representable. Now, I lean on the work of two of my junior colleagues, one actually Zachary Horton, who went to UC Santa Barbara, and he wrote a beautiful book called The Cosmic Zoom. It's about scale. It's very architectural, actually, though he's not trained in architecture. And it makes very much, it will make a lot of sense if you, think of it a little deeply, that scale is something that depends on, which scale you can resolve some things at one scale that you cannot resolve in other scales. It's very simple. It's not complicated. But I'm going to read this out. Scale is a reference frame wherein certain differences can be detected or resolved, while others fall either above or below the perspectival threshold of differentiation. Great example, let's think of gold. This bangle, this is gold. It looks golden to me. At nanoscale, it's green, orange, whatever. It's not gold, okay? So that's color. But that also means, the thing that interests me is that once you change scale, you notice things that you would not have noticed at a different scale. Again, this is really kind of simple. But something that comes through that is what I call scalar alterity. Once you change scale, something happens. So a differentiation, an otherness emerges. But because what it forces us to do is rethink the relation between object, subject, and process. How do processes work? Because you will notice processes working at a scale that is impossible to discern. And this is, in other words, what I'm saying is that you're not just misusing scale, you're simply not addressing certain scales of imagination. So what kind of scalar manipulation would we have to do to engage with scalar alterity? And this is, what I believe is axiomatic, is alterity inheres in scalar thinking. What scale we choose is fundamental in terms of our understanding of the landscape. And this is not just a sort of a complaint about people dealing with big scale. I just wrote a book called Small Spaces, but where I make very clear I'm not always just talking about dimensionally small spaces. The spaces can be actually very large. But that doesn't mean that you're intervening at particular scales of imagination. Scale is more important than size. This next thing is vantage. In a way, it's the old question that Raymond Williams asked. With whom do you stand? With whom do you identify? Now here, John Lewis Garris, historian, sort of articulated what he thought was the work of the historian. What do historians do? For him, this image of Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog completely, beautifully encapsulated the idea. What is the idea? That you're standing on a high vantage, looking at this vast landscape. You have distance. You are separated from the object of investigation. And according to him, this gives us, gets us out of the familiar. And so you have this, not just the broad view, you have the sort of the mastery over the large scale. You have the broad view. That is what's desirable for a historian. This requires rethinking. Now, I had sent, when Louis Shelley and Ashley asked me for an image, I sent an image, one of my photographs, not very good. And I noticed when it was advertised, this image was actually inserted. Beautiful image, don't you think? Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful photograph. Come on, it's graphically very good. It actually has exactly the problem that I'm articulating. It is that it is a bird's eye view. It is as distant from the Gangetic Plains as possible. This is the fundamental problem we're dealing with. If this is the scale from which on Gangetic Plains, we're talking about regional scale, certainly beyond architectural scale, right? The point is, and this is my entry point, I was trained as an architect, not a planner. I can do any scale, but I actually am an architectural historian. I approach it from the point of view of architectural history. What is my entree here? So this is not something that I will take not only as at face value, but this is, for me, if I begin here, I will end up here. This is where my vantage needs to change, my scale needs to change. The questions I'm going to ask will change if I shift my vantage and move to what I call a proximate vantage. What would architectural histories be if we approached it from a proximate vantage? And proximity, and I'm talking about really kind of intimacy between me and the landscape, me and what I think is outside of me, which is not outside of me. I'm permeated by that. This is something that we don't recognize. We think social processes are like somebody else's life, man. It's not mine. No, it's your life. It's your landscape. So with this sort of introduction, I want to get into the project on which I'm basing this talk. And I had, this is what I call my epic project. I've been working on this for by this time, 15 years, perhaps 20. And the reason I got interested in it, because I was interested in how the infrastructural, architectural stuff that happened in this vast region, but I was also curious. What the heck is the Gangetic Plains? Where was that term coined? How do we know what is the Gangetic Plains? We presume, oh, there's a Ganges and there must be the Gangetic Plains. Wrong. There are actually lots of different ecological zones. So what do we mean? Well, it doesn't take, as a somebody who studies the British Empire, it doesn't take a long time to figure out it's a colonial construct. But you still have to ask why the colonial construct? Like, what are you getting out of constructing this massive ideas of region? So Chris Bailey, eminent historian of British Empire, wrote a really good book. It's called Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars. He's talking about North India and the mercantile class and how they were negotiating the advent of British rule. Really kind of micrograined history, really good. But as a historian, space is kind of in the background. Space is not something that they deal with. There's one thing usually nobody can accuse us of. We don't think of space as background. We think space is the stuff. But he had a very beautiful description, and I'm going to read this out. The Valley of the Ganges was the main axis of Britain's Asian empire. Along its length ran Kim's Grand Trunk Road, which linked British Bengal with the capital cities of Mughal India and pointed northward to the high regions of Central Asia. Down the river, in the course of the 19th century, were transported huge quantities of cotton, opium, and indigo, bound for China and Europe to balance the books of Britain's Oriental trade. By 1880, a railway ran along the riverbank, speeding Lancashire goods to their mass market in the interior, but also bringing the angry young men of Bengal in contact with the conservative leaders of the Hindu and Muslim heartland. This is his introduction. It's a beautiful introduction. And you get the map, right? You can visualize this. So it's a very good sort of narrative description. And he knew the sources. This is what he was describing. There are actually lots of these plans of the Grand Trunk Road. You can see the road, and here the road is in red, and then you can notice that, oh, you don't have to figure out what exactly is in the plan. This is not my primary issue here. What it does show is that here you have Calcutta, so this is the Bay of Bengal here, and you're going up here across the Ganges. But as any map, it shows some information. It doesn't show others. It just enhances the infrastructural network. This is Britain's infrastructural control of the Gangetic Plains. And the Grand Trunk Road actually predates the Mughal, British intervention. It's a Mughal road, which was redone to serve colonial goals and imperatives. So I wanted to take this apart a bit. So the questions I was asking in the project were very fundamental, very basic. How was the plains, mapped, defined, constructed, inhabited? Large questions. And of course, how is water infrastructure understood? How was it understood? How is it changed? And I got very interested in how is the relation between land and water. We think of these as two different things. Well, not quite. How are they constructed? How were they negotiated? Because any infrastructural intervention, you will have to make some decisions about the relation between the two. So these were my basic questions. Now, just to make sure I explain that I'll be talking about, this part of this is the lower Gangetic Plains. This is the part that you saw in the map. And this is the area that I'm going to ultimately talk about. Now, mapping, and this is, 18th, 19th century cartography I'm going to talk about. There's always a sense that this is about, surety, this is about control. And Matthew Edney beautifully sort of put it, saying that it's supposed to be, the mapping process is supposed to be distant, privileged, disciplined. In other words, the surveyor is doing this wonderful objective work of describing the landscape, primarily for military reconnaissance, and then for revenue surveys. And he also inserted something else in it. He said it's very interesting that you almost never see any depiction of surveyors in the ground, on the ground. And the one that he could find is actually a caricature, because here's this poor surveyor, and he's described as Lieutenant Lake Engineer, obviously made up name, and he is kind of in the muck trying to figure out something across this stream. And there is the field book, everything is there except that he's in a holy mess. And this is the sort of the idea of being in the land and dealing with the messiness of the work of surveying or work of any kind of construction, any kind of intervention that requires, challenging the logics of land and water, are usually erased from representations, whether representation of maps or buildings and so on and so forth. Think of it how we think about, building plans. They usually come as, this one description, and we're supposed to imagine what it is like when it's inhabited by different people, what it is like during day and night. There's only one plan. Today, Louis took me to Monticello, and we were looking at those plans, and we are very familiar with that, but it's also very nice to see that it's, the pointing out, oh, these people, these are the uses. So people, the enslaved lived here, worked here, these are the main rooms, and so on and so forth. But it presumes that that plan appeared exactly like that to everyone, when it did not. So in other words, the idea of whether it is a map as a representation or the architectural plan as a representation requires a lot of work from us. But one surveyor, and he was the first one who was given the charge of mapping the Gangetic Plains, James Rennell, and he started it in 1764. And he was not, 1764 to 1767 is when he was really on the field. And the last time he was on the field was 1771. And he produced lots of maps. He was the one who first produced what is considered sort of authoritative maps of British India. Now, he was a marine surveyor, and he was very young. He was in his 20s, given this task of military reconnaissance. And he encountered a landscape, like all of them did, that he was absolutely unfamiliar with. He didn't know how to deal with this, because not only water moved here in this lower Gangetic Plains, rivers move without warning, and water can change the courses between, not just because of tidal effect, but between morning and afternoon. One season, it would be completely not recognizable another season. And these are the things that they are sort of grappling with. One of the things I spent a lot of time looking at James Rennell's map, because he had, he was trying to kind of craft, cobble together a way of mapping these. His maps are filled with annotations. And these are not, of course, he submitted these, but these are not his finished maps. These are very close to his field journals. So you look at his field journals, look at these maps, you get a really kind of nitty-gritty sense of what this is about. And he has, probably it will be impossible for you to read where you are, and he has, this is wet season. This is dry season. This is sort of sand, means the term is chur. But there's no guarantee that these lines would actually be fixed. Like it changes, like, from 1 hour to another. Definitely changes from one season to another. So what's the point in mapping? If all of this changes, what's the point in mapping? Nobody stopped doing maps, mind you. Now, for navigational purposes, Rennell's maps were completely useless about 20 years after he did them. But they remained, and this is very important, this remained useful for, and they were used for revenue administration. Because by the 1790s, the colonial state, East India Company, was in charge of revenue administration, and they were actually implemented a new form of revenue administration. So these maps, for me, are very instructive in terms of what it says about the time. He's really trying to capture a temporal dimension in maps which are very fixed entities, to the extent that in one map, for example, he's written here, tiger tracks. He's like pug marks of tigers. This is the part of the Sundarbans. And he knows, of course, all of us know that the marks won't be there, in a few hours, but that doesn't seem to bother him. For him, this is important, to actually record what we would call the ephemeral landscape. For him, this was really important this is about him and the understanding of the landscape. And of course, as you can imagine, his maps, this kind of maps with this annotation, simply kind of disappeared pretty much after him. He also strenuously objected to messing with the rivers. He didn't use the term messing, I am, but he said that changing the course of rivers or cutting between channels would be not only futile, but it would be devastating, because he recognized something about these rivers, that you cannot train these rivers. That's the term, that's the 19th century term. You train rivers. You try to discipline them into the ideal, sort of parallel channels of the banks and control them and make them useful. They have to be working rivers. Now, this map here doesn't have those annotations. And it's actually, when I first encountered this in the British Library, it's a beautiful map, right? We can agree that it's a beautiful drawing, right? And this is what one of the authors, there were the brothers Morrison who were doing the survey of the Sundarbans. And they were kind of despondent. Great difficulties arise in carrying on the immense extent of the jungle, the habitation of tigers and other beasts of prey, preventing the possibility of landing on almost every part of the extensive tract, the varieties of tides and currents flowing from 100 different channels, like they're lost. They did not actually get off from their boat onto the land, fear of wild beasts. This beautiful map, all of this, it's actually, this is what, when we were going to architecture school, I'm sure you never did this. It's called fudging. All of this is completely nonsense. It's actually just filling. And these streams, they will change before probably they even left. This map, he was mildly scolded. They were mildly scolded for, because it was useless for revenue administration purposes and definitely for navigation. Now, it is true that, in terms of this lower Gangetic Plains, pilots were told never to rely on maps, okay? You really needed experienced pilots to navigate these streams. Otherwise, you really need to know something about the land and the moving water. Now, here comes the mid-19th century. So we are about a century after James Rennell. Here comes James Ferguson, who is better known as an architectural historian, having written all those books that we love to read. No, we don't. It's deeply colonial, deeply problematic, but nevertheless, he is known as an architectural historian. So he wrote a very influential article. He gave a paper in the Geological Society in London, and it was on the recent changes in the delta of the Ganges. And he tried to show that, yes, these rivers change course very frequently. And he knew something about it. He was working in the agency house that his father founded. His father did many things, but he was an indigo planter. So he spent about 5 years in an indigo plantation in Jessore, which would be about here. And I'm going to show you a few more maps to articulate that region. So what he wanted to show in this map is that all the red lines are the changes from before and after Rennell. So rivers and this scale, this is, have moved, these are miles, they moved miles. But it did not, very interestingly, unlike Rennell, it did not pose a problem to him. But he gave one of the most interesting descriptions of this, what I call the mobile land. The river is nearly where it is shown on the map, but as it was there in 5053. It certainly is not there now. The city of Sirajganj, the largest and most important mart in that part of the country, is somewhere in the neighborhood now, but not where marked in the map, of course. And it is annually obliged to accommodate itself to the vagaries of the stream and change its locality. It may be 10 miles up the stream, or 10 miles further down, or 5 miles further east and west, but is somewhere thereabout. And this is not simply about, oh, we can't depend on maps because everything has changed. But the fact is, towns, villages move. This is not something we deal with. In other words, they move seasonally. And they have to be equipped to move seasonally. Here, changing courses of rivers and flooding are anticipated events. These are not exceptions. So you need to know how to do that. How do you move a town? Mart meaning market. How do you move an entire market? But again, this somehow was not a problem to him, despite the fact that he said that his house, in this indigo plantation, was simply washed away by the river, and now it is in a difference of 30 to 40 feet, and so the bricks of his house are 30 to 40 feet down, and this is talking about 5-10 years. So in other words, if you want to think about stratigraphy and think about what is kind of a neat layering of strata, you can't do that. In other words, you cannot draw historical inferences by looking at stratigraphy, because the water moves and all of those layers are messed up. In other words, the standard archaeological methods would not work here. This is why he was interested in the Gangetic Plains, because his interest was archaeological and architectural. Nevertheless, it was not a problem for him. what he did was what I call the leap to generalization. He knew that these rivers change courses frequently and without, warning, very difficult to map, very difficult to predict. And if you cannot predict, you cannot construct infrastructure. If you cannot predict this is from the point of view of the colonial state, you cannot think of property as fixed. What happens to property when it kind of goes away, washes away? So how are you going to deal with it? And what he did interestingly, he kind of did these exercises. So he was trying to show that, depending on the slope of the land, the tributaries joining a river would, take different configurations. And the Ganges this is kind of more close to it. In other words, he needed to think about a general form of organization and flow of rivers rather than the particularity, because he cannot deal with the particularity. But he did say something very interesting. He was one of the few people who did. And he drew this, this sketch trying to show how, river water meets the water of the adjacent water bodies and comes to an equilibrium. And his axiom was, water resists water better than land resists water. So you have to understand how rivers flowing and the adjacent water bodies, which were extensive, massive tracts of water, massive areas of water, how they sort of kept each other. And what these extended water bodies did, it forced the river to deposit its silt, so to create the banks. And he argued that it would take the river about a century to actually overcome and they were called shields. That's what he called them. They were not always called shields, but the term in Bengali to describe these water bodies. So he actually thought of these as, the rivers warring with each other. So very kind of a belligerent language of landscape. And interesting. So the question is, how does water move? And I'm thinking of the lower Gangetic plains and its particular fluvial dynamics, its particular hydrological properties. Now, there are actually very interestingly, very few visual representations, and I'm a sucker for visual representation. I want a visual representation of these extended, still water bodies. So one is actually, and this is definitely drawn from the description. This is in a German print, and it shows it says the Cheel is in flood time, and notice that the houses are there. You can't read any of this, but what it says is that these are kind of like strange phenomena, that these extensive water bodies, they grow during the rainy season and they flood, but these mean houses of the native, they somehow remain above the water line. In other words, they know exactly how the Cheel moves, how the water rises. And this is a standard complaint that the houses of these people are like that. The description always is mean because they are made of earth, and it's in its thatch and sometimes tile roof, but it's really earth architecture. And they thought they don't have any sense of comfort, have any sense of actually investing in this thing called a house. And to give you a sense of, and this is a part of the region that I'm paying a lot of attention to, and this area is called the Nadia Rivers, and this is Nadia as a district in West Bengal, which is the part of the low Gangetic plains that falls within the Indian state of West Bengal, because it is now divided into between Bangladesh and the Indian state of West Bengal. So give you a sense that the 1771s are actually shown in green, so that's Reynolds. Okay, then the mid 18th century are shown in red, mid 19th century, and then the black lines are from 1918. Our surveys were done a couple of years earlier, so you can get a sense of how, and this is how the sort of the pattern of change in the course of the rivers. Now, if you have seen those maps of Mississippi, this is not actually strange that deltaic rivers behave like this. But again, the way the Mississippi Delta works is not the way the Gangetic Delta works. Okay, and this is one of the things that Ferguson really wanted to understand, how the Nile Delta, Mississippi Delta, and Gangetic Delta, what is common among them, because he wants a form of generalization. So what happens is that when rivers move like that, they leave behind these patches of land, and they could be extensive patches, and they could be something like this. But it could, again, the rivers could come back to their older stream. So people never actually destroy something intentionally. They leave it for, let's say, anticipating if the river might come back. Now, I'm very interested in this relation between the rivers and what is called backwaters. The still water bodies, which are so extensive that they were described as innumerable. So I'm going to talk about this one part of this is the Lower Gangetic Plains, and this is the main stream of the Ganges, and this is the Ichamati, which is a smaller stream. And this location is the location of a indigo plantation. This region, with all these moving rivers, they were the prime region for indigo cultivation in the 19th century. And you should ask why? Because access to fresh water, river water, is very important for indigo. And this is where they were competing with rice cultivation. So what happens is that all of the indigo plantations, and there were some major concerns like the Bengal indigo plantation, that's a concern, basically company, and it had something like, if I remember my numbers correctly, about 15 different plantations. So one of them, the very well known, is Mulnath here. Notice we don't see the detail here. Notice the details here. This is Mulnath and its environs. So this is the river. All of these are oxbow lakes. In other words, they are older streams of the river, which it has left many times to create these lakes. And this one here, this oxbow lake, which is cut off from this main channel, is and was treated like a lake within the plantation. And that's the river, that's the lake, so this has been cut off. But in rainy season, they're actually one and the same water body. And when, there was also an aqueduct built to make sure that water is conveyed to the plantations. And Swati Grant, who wrote about this as a sort of a defense of indigo cultivation by European planters in India. Because in 1859 and 1860, the indigo revolt really shook the sort of the basis, because peasants simply refused to cultivate indigo because it put them in debt bondage from which they could not recover. And it's not simply that we want to cultivate another crop, it's just that the way money advances were made and what they had to live with in terms of debt went from one generation to another, basically doing labor for free. So if you cannot have enslaved labor, that's the closest you can come to basically bonded labor. So the Swati Grant, and I want to thank here Sarah, who took me to your library today, because I did not have good images of this. So they were all, digital images were not very good. So I just took these images today. I was from the book, because you guys have the book. And what the argument here is that this plantation house, and it was about 100 feet in front. It had 18 apartments, apart from bathrooms and all of that. Kitchen, etc., was always outside. It had a complete basement with fireplaces and so on and so forth. So you didn't have to, you can actually heat up, food there, because the kitchen was outside the main house. And it was described as, the planter he was visiting was James Forlow. And his successor there was considered what I call the implacable enemy of the peasant. Okay, so this is the center of, one of the prime centers of the indigo revolt, okay, because this is where Bengal indigo, the masters lived. And what is interesting is that this lake was described in picturesque terms. In other words, it's completely folded into kind of a beautiful landscape scenery, really not attending to until much later that it is an integral part of a working landscape. This is the reason why you would even bother to have a plantation so close to a river, because you want access to that water. And then there was all sorts of descriptions about the park here and how Forlong had done everything to root out visible elements of the Bengal landscape. He wanted the place to look European. And so in other words, this is the ideal European landscape in Bengal, just by the fact that you're dealing with landscape conditions which are peculiar to that region, without which none of this would work. And the main idea was that in this sort of personified good European agency, design, taste, absolutely important for improvement of the country and the meanness of the native inhabitations. In other words, it's not simply that they are, as you said, poor, they are and poor they will remain until by moral improvement they can be made to be better. So that it's completely, we don't need to get into the sort of the moral arguments about poverty. But the point is that, and I'm interested in the material discussion here, what is considered comfort in this location. And, honestly, in the weather of Bengal, why would you want to have a fireplace at all, right? It's like the last thing you need is a fireplace, okay? But it does have a sense of European comfort. But the idea that mud buildings are actually, the markers of poverty. And it confounded them that wealthy Indians in rural areas close to rivers, yes, they built with mud because they were not stupid. Okay, they knew that it could be washed away. So where wealth was deposited was in movable property, anything that you could move. Now I want to shift vantage because we've been talking about the colonial point of view. And here I sort of invoke writer, painter, dancer, Rani Chanda, who writing in the 1970s, the book is called Amar Mar Bapir Bari, which means my mother's father's house. And this is, to her, it was a lost landscape already. She was writing about life there in the 19-teens and basically think of the time of the First World War. And she describes flooding. It's about life in the village. And what I was very taken by, that how she describes floodwaters entering the village. This village is, they had to move from Dhaka, which was the one important city at that time, Eastern Bengal, now Bangladesh, is the capital. And you had to take a boat ride through the streams for pretty much an entire day to reach this village. So it was, problematic term, remote, but it was remote as remote gets, because there was no decent road infrastructure. The great thing it was, during the rains, it was very good, because now you could use boats everywhere. Because now that all countries want sheet of water, now boats can go anywhere. So she describes the flood coming in, the excitement in the village. So before dawn, the news reaches that water has entered Ghoshbari's Khal. Khal is a channel. All of us, young and old, run to see. The water advances in a torrent. The Khal is filling up, the gurgling water. Water from the Khal brims over and turns south and enters Nondi's Pukur. Pukur is a pond. We run along the water. It's filling up. The water moves along the Khal and advances. The point of Noyabari is filling up. So it's filling up one pond after another. After filling up the two largest ponds in the neighborhood, the water spills over the banks, flooding the south side, and travels towards Siddheshwaritala, which is a locality. On the other side, the Beel, and that's the term for those sort of deep depressions which would be filled with water. I'm going to show you some images in a bit. Are filling up, and the waters of the Beel and the Khal become one. And then it still keeps rising. The banks overflow, the water approaches the boundaries of the house, and then one day it moves into the interior courtyard. Inside the courtyard, and this is not that house that she describes, but how would that be? It would have a higher plinth. Plinth would be about at least 5 foot high, because to make sure the house remains above floodwater. So this is the kind of house it would be. Probably much more better decorated, because she's talking about a wealthy landowner's house. So the water rises 5 fingers, ankle deep, knee deep, up to the waist, and then the gurgling stops. That's all the flood is going to do this year. It stops. So consider this. There's a courtyard around which the living apartments are organized. So it is expected that the water will come and stay there for 3 months. For us, it would be a catastrophe. because we don't know how to live with floods. This was a normal expectation. So a bamboo bridge had been built across the courtyard to connect the apartments on one side to another. And the boats now actually, and she describes this in great detail, that now all the vendors, all kind of social relations actually kick up, because now you can go with boat anywhere. Because again, the road infrastructure was really bad. So floods actually helped move people and goods. It actually created an economy in a way that was not possible before. Before that, it was far more fragmented. But what is important is that she describes this veranda, that's called dawa, becomes a new threshold. From there, you can fish now. Because now that all waters are the same, you actually can get fish in there. You don't even have to move out. But she also describes moving out to those water bodies that I'm referring to, and describes collecting edible flowers, collecting greens. But it is also, think of the landscape, and you think of a landscape as not fixed, it's fluid landscape. The more difficult thing is then the water is draining, because it comes actually, might be in a torrent, but it's very expected, but when the water recedes, it recedes really fast. And so she has this beautiful description that, one day, one of the neighbor notices that the rice fields are moving. What that means is that the prolonged inundation has loosened the rice from the ground. So entire fields are moving. And that means they have to be fenced in, otherwise you have no idea where one will lead to. In other words, there is some notion of property that, this is my field, that's your field, and that's somebody else's field. You have to, your revenue is due. So you have to think about moving fields, and you need basically bamboo palings to put them in place. Now that is a fluid landscape. And she writes very beautifully, very evocatively. This is in Bangla. But so she describes how once they're stabilized, and this is where the rains will cease, and this is what we call the monsoon crop. So the monsoon crop will actually be harvested soon. So it will be harvested in winter. So it needs that time for the rains to stop, the sun to shine, and then it'll get this beautiful green. Now, once the rains are done, other things that happen, which is when everything has to be cleaned, of course, courtyard is a layer of muck by that time. So everything has to be cleaned. And then the festive season starts. So she describes how, I'm thinking about how to describe the architecture of the house. So the central courtyards would be sort of painted with rice paste. In other words, you grind rice and you put it in water, and then you make these elaborate designs by hand, not with a brush, because there's a particular art of doing it where you can actually, it has a particular mechanism of doing it to get a particular kind of pattern. The paintbrush doesn't do it. Now, this could be patterns which would be kind of span the entire courtyard, and this is women's work primarily. And the image I have, because I don't have an image from Rani Chandra's book, because she was in Shantiniketan for many years. This is where she also practiced that art is called Alpana, these designs. And there in Shantiniketan, in the art school in Shantiniketan, it was brought to a really sort of sophisticated, kind of given the sort of the mantle of art, and designs were collected and tried to kind of make it kind of a something, and interestingly, that's durable, a durable art form. But this is absolutely ephemeral. That art will be washed away the next day. But you don't refrain from doing these elaborate patterns because it will be washed away, because it will be renewed next year for the next festival. That creates more opportunities. So there's something about the duration, so the durational imagination of these landscapes, which actually is fundamental to thinking how we can understand its architecture. And these designs are actually have drawn from the landscape itself. So these are some of the basic designs of this Alpana, and they can be at the thresholds between, on the veranda, at the door, and then the courtyard. And they have particular names, but they are linked to basically rice stalks, fish scales, water spinach. You're basically describing a riverine landscape. Excuse me. Now, what is the language of water? We can think of the language of water in terms of how it moves, what landscape it creates, and the architectural, and I'm thinking of building here in a very narrow sense, building responses to that. But also what, excuse me, occurred to me that so very few of the Bengali terms are ever used in any of the literature on fluvial anything in Bengal, despite the fact that Bengali is a very rich language. There are over 70 words to describe water bodies. And this is not the entire list. I'm showing you this in Bengali because most of you won't be able to read it, right? So there's a certain, impossibility here. But think of, and this is where it's important, not more than the ones in yellow here that I have ever found referenced in any English language work. That includes the work of contemporary scholars, many of whom are Bengalis, because it is not the language of science. To make that landscape recognizable to an international audience, terms like streams, creeks, do you know the difference between a jheel and a beel? Do you know the difference between a haor and a baur? Unless you really study the region, you won't. The thing is that British surveyors sometimes use the word jheel, then they call them morasses, marshes, lakes, and you can't, a water body cannot be all three at the same time. And then they use them interchangeably because they really didn't know how to describe them because of their peculiar geomorphology, because of their peculiar hydrology. And this is where, a text like Rani Chanda's helps us understand, not just, she's not writing a scientific tract, gets us understand what it means to a community, a people. If names and terms are portals to how we live, our worlds, it's important to register what this landscape would look like if you thought through that language, lens of that language. And this is for, I thought I should behave and include some English terms, but I will tell you, these terms are actually doesn't describe those water bodies exactly. These are, at best, the handy, sort of term as the closest I can come to because I don't have more time to explain that kind of an attitude. So what I've tried doing is actually trying to understand this landscape. And yes, I have an in, I speak the language, I think in the language, and I'm looking at two particular regions. One is actually very close to Calcutta, this is Calcutta here. This area, which this is a 19th century map, and this area, this, what is called a beel, though it's called a beel, it's actually an oxbow lake. And it's an immense amount of water body. The common understanding was that, these don't, in summer months, they don't have water. No, they do. Some of them do. Some of them don't. So it's not like some of, everything, all the water goes away in the dry season. In some, they do. So I'm looking at these water bodies, and just to give you a sense, if you see any of these, and this is in a swamp. So I'm looking at, and this is the area that I'm talking about. It actually says this is Jashore, this is Krishnanagar, this is Hooghly, this is Indigo country. So I'm looking at the relation between the historical construction of infrastructure and a plantation landscape, and what it means to sort of think about that landscape now. And it is, and this is one of the beels, and it's Borti beel, closer to Calcutta. It's in a sort of the just beyond the greater Calcutta agglomeration. And this is the beel when I was there this July, because this is the monsoons. Okay. So this is the season for retting and harvesting jute. It's backbreaking labor. because you have to stand in water waist deep to actually do this work. So I'm not romanticizing this landscape. But it's also, at the same time, a beautiful landscape. And this is something that I find very interesting, is that, again, this is a language where there is lots of evocative descriptions of rivers and so on and so forth. There are very few of beels, because they were always a working landscape. And in dry season, when I was there in March, think of this, between March and July, it's an entirely changed landscape. Here, this is rice cultivation. This is, it's called borodhan. This is you plant it in November, and then it would be, you can reap it in, like May, okay? So here, there's a channel there, and you can actually have to, get water from there to get water to the rice. But it is actually very helpful, because the water, the ground is actually quite saturated in any case. Rice requires a lot of water, okay? And different types of rice require different kinds of water. So when I was looking at that, and I knew that, when you think of this is where you could, it's basically a resting place for the workers. And this is a little kind of a tea shop. And there you can see that they know exactly how much water will rise, because this is not going to be done away in the monsoons. But even in the dry season, if you looked closely, if you looked really closely to the ground, you would notice that there are these mollusk shells. You know this is that watery landscape. It might not have water then. The water relation between water and land has shifted tremendously, but the traces remain. My job, I've taken this for myself, is to really think about how to look at the soil closely, to imagine how this would change our understanding of architecture at all scales, from the small to the large. Thank you.